The first time she held that little girl close, the millionaire sneered at her and spat words sharper than knives. "That's not your job." Silence swallowed the kitchen afterward, but inside, the cook's heart wrenched with the sting of invisibility. Her hands trembled as she set Emily down, the child's sleepy warmth still lingering on her chest. "I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who won't even thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart." In a gleaming penthouse overlooking Manhattan's bustling streets, where every surface reflected wealth like mirrors catching sunlight, lived a contradiction wrapped in marble and steel. The kitchen was a monument to excess. Sub-zero refrigerators hummed quietly beside professional-grade ovens that cost more than most people's annual salary. Copper pots gleamed on custom shelves, their surfaces unmarred by use, while a wine collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars lined temperature-controlled walls. Yet for all its splendor, the space felt hollow, like a beautiful shell stripped of its soul. Here, in the heart of this cold perfection, worked Rosa Martinez, a woman whose calloused hands told stories of 30 years spent stirring love into meals for families who never learned her middle name. At 52, Rosa carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had long ago stopped expecting recognition, but never stopped giving her best. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, secured with the same simple black elastic she'd used for years. She wore her uniform, a crisp white apron over dark slacks and comfortable shoes, like armor against a world that insisted on looking through her instead of at her. Rosa had grown up in a small apartment in Washington Heights, where her grandmother taught her that food was the language of love, spoken fluent through the sizzle of onions in hot oil and the patient kneading of masa for tamales. Even now, decades later, she could close her eyes and hear Abuela's voice. "Mija, when you cook with anger, the food tastes bitter. When you cook with love, even simple beans become a feast." Those lessons had carried her through years of serving families who measured worth in stock portfolios and cryptocurrency investments rather than the tenderness folded into every meal. The penthouse belonged to Victor Langley, a man whose net worth exceeded $800 million, built through a combination of real estate ventures, tech investments, and a keen eye for emerging markets, including Bitcoin and other digital assets. At 60, Victor possessed everything money could buy: properties in the Hamptons, a private art collection, investments that generated passive income while he slept. Yet he moved through his gleaming home like a ghost, surrounded by luxury but starved of the simple warmth that Rosa infused into every dish she prepared. Rosa's domain was the kitchen, and she ruled it with quiet efficiency from 5 in the morning until well past 8 at night. She knew Victor's schedule better than his personal assistant: black coffee and whole grain toast at precisely 7, lunch meetings that required elegant canapes, dinner parties that showcased her skills while keeping her invisible in the background. She understood his moods through the way he held his coffee cup, could predict his needs before he voiced them, and had memorized which foods brought him as close to contentment as his fractured heart would allow. The morning routine was sacred to Rosa. She would arrive in the pre-dawn darkness, her keys jingling softly as she let herself in through the service entrance. The kitchen would be spotless from her cleaning the night before, every surface gleaming under the recessed lighting. She would start the coffee first, a dark Colombian roast that Victor's palate had grown accustomed to, though he'd never thanked her for remembering his preference. Then came the assessment, checking the refrigerator's contents, planning the day's meals, calculating portions with the precision of someone who had learned that waste was not tolerated in houses where every dollar was tracked and accounted for. But it was in the quiet moments, when Victor's wife Margaret retreated to her yoga studio and the household staff went about their duties, that Rosa allowed herself to remember why she had first fallen in love with cooking. She would hum softly under her breath old boleros her mother had sung while preparing Sunday dinners, and let her hands move with the practiced grace of decades. Chopping vegetables became meditation, the rhythmic thock of the knife against the cutting board, creating a soundtrack for her solitary contentment. The Langley household operated like a well-oiled machine. Every person assigned their role, every function serving the greater goal of maintaining Victor's image and comfort. Margaret, beautiful at 55 and preserved by the finest cosmetic procedures money could buy, floated through the penthouse like an elegant specter, more concerned with her charitable foundation boards and social calendar than with the daily mechanics of their life. Their son lived in California, visiting only for holidays and major family events, while their daughter-in-law brought the grandchildren for carefully scheduled visits that never lasted long enough to disturb the penthouse's pristine order. It was during one of these visits that Rosa first encountered 3-year-old Emily, a child who possessed her grandfather's sharp intelligence but her grandmother's wandering attention. Emily had a habit of escaping from the nanny and finding her way to the kitchen, drawn by the warm glow and comforting aromas that seemed to promise safety in an adult world of marble coldness and hushed conversations about inheritance taxes and trust funds. Rosa discovered that Emily preferred her scrambled eggs slightly runny, liked her apple slices cut into stars rather than wedges, and would eat vegetables if they were arranged to look like flowers on her plate. These small preferences became treasures that Rosa guarded carefully, tiny insights into a child's world that felt infinitely more real than the financial reports and investment strategies that dominated adult conversations in the penthouse. The first time Emily crawled into Rosa's lap, seeking comfort after a scraped knee from running in the hallway, Rosa felt something awaken in her chest that had been dormant for years. The child's weight was warm and trusting, her small fingers absently tracing patterns on Rosa's apron, while Rosa murmured soft Spanish endearments and stroked her hair. It lasted only minutes before the nanny found them, but in that brief embrace, Rosa remembered what it felt like to be needed for something beyond her ability to prepare meals and maintain spotless surfaces. Victor found them the second time it happened. Emily had fallen asleep against Rosa's shoulder during an afternoon lull, exhausted from playing hide-and-seek with the housekeeper's daughter who had been brought to work that day. Rosa was gently rocking in the kitchen chair she had claimed as her own, one hand supporting the sleeping child while the other stirred a pot of soup that would become dinner. The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, creating golden squares on the floor, and for a moment, the space felt like what it should have been all along, the heart of a home. "That's not your job." Victor's voice cut through the peaceful moment like a blade through silk. He stood in the doorway, his expression hard with disapproval, his gray eyes reflecting the same coldness that characterized everything else in his carefully controlled world. "Mind your place." The words hung in the air between them, sharp with class distinction and the unstated reminder of exactly where Rosa belonged in the hierarchy of his household. Rosa felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down as she had learned to do with all the small cruelties that peppered her days. She carefully shifted Emily to wake her gently, then handed the drowsy child over to her grandfather with the same efficient kindness she brought to every task. Only her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she turned back to her soup, stirring it with unnecessary vigor, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The years that followed were marked by 1,000 small humiliations, each one carefully designed to reinforce the invisible walls that separated Rosa's world from theirs. Victor would inspect her work with the critical eye of someone evaluating an investment, pointing out perceived flaws in meals that guests praised lavishly. Margaret would change menu plans at the last moment, requiring Rosa to scramble to accommodate dietary restrictions or preferences that shifted like stock prices, unpredictable and demanding immediate response. The other household staff maintained a careful distance from Rosa, recognizing that association with someone so clearly marked as other could jeopardize their own positions in the delicate ecosystem of service that kept the penthouse running smoothly. The housekeeper, a woman named Patricia who had worked for wealthy families her entire adult life, maintained professional politeness but never offered the camaraderie that might have made the long days more bearable. The groundskeeper, responsible for the rooftop garden that provided fresh herbs for Rosa's cooking, nodded respectfully but hurried past conversations, afraid that lingering might be interpreted as wasted time. Rosa learned to find solace in the rhythm of her work, in the satisfaction of creating beauty from simple ingredients, in the knowledge that her hands were skilled and her instincts sound even when her worth was questioned daily. She perfected dishes that became family favorites, her herb-crusted salmon that Victor requested for important business dinners, her chocolate soufflé that Margaret served to impress visitors, her homemade pasta that Emily asked for on every visit. Yet credit for these successes was never acknowledged, the compliments flowing around her like water around a stone. The kitchen became Rosa's sanctuary, the one place where she could control outcomes through skill and dedication. She knew exactly how Victor liked his coffee, strong enough to power through 12-hour days reviewing acquisition proposals and monitoring cryptocurrency fluctuations. She understood Margaret's preference for light, beautiful meals that photographed well for her Instagram posts about healthy living and mindful consumption. She adapted to dietary trends and restrictions with the flexibility of someone whose livelihood depended on pleasing palates that changed as frequently as investment portfolios. But it was in the quiet moments, when the penthouse settled into evening calm and Rosa finished her final preparations for the next day, that the weight of invisibility pressed heaviest on her shoulders. She would stand at the kitchen sink, washing dishes by hand despite the presence of 2 industrial-grade dishwashers, finding peace in the warm water and the repetitive motion that allowed her mind to wander. Sometimes she thought about her grandmother, wondering what advice she might offer about dignity in the face of dismissal. Other times, she imagined a different life, one where her skills were celebrated rather than taken for granted, where her presence was welcomed rather than endured. These moments of melancholy were interrupted by practical concerns, checking inventory, planning shopping lists, calculating the cost of ingredients against household budgets that could accommodate any expense but demanded justification for every purchase. Rosa had become expert at finding the perfect balance between quality and economy, sourcing the finest ingredients at prices that wouldn't draw unwanted attention from accountants who monitored even households' expenses with corporate precision. The isolation was perhaps the hardest burden to bear. Rosa lived alone in a small studio apartment in Queens, a 40-minute subway ride from the gleaming wealth of Manhattan's Upper East Side. Her evenings were spent preparing for the next day's work, her weekends occupied by grocery shopping and meal preparation that extended her professional duties into her personal time. She had few friends, the demanding schedule of service having gradually eroded social connections that required reciprocity and availability she could rarely provide. Family visits were infrequent. Her sister lived in Florida with her own family. Their conversations reduced to occasional phone calls that highlighted the growing distance between their experiences. Rosa's nephew sometimes sent pictures of his children, her great-nieces and nephews, who lived in textbook pages rather than her daily reality. She sent money when she could, contributing to school expenses and birthday celebrations for children who knew her primarily as a name on greeting cards, their Tia Rosa existing more as concept than presence. The financial security of her position was both blessing and trap. Victor paid well by industry standards, and the consistency of employment provided stability that many in her situation couldn't claim. Her salary allowed for a modest savings account, careful contributions to a retirement fund, and the ability to send occasional help to family members who struggled with their own economic challenges. Yet this security came at the cost of autonomy, tying her to a situation where respect was rationed and appreciation was as rare as genuine affection. Rosa had developed strategies for managing the emotional toll of her invisible status. She found refuge in small acts of creativity, testing new recipes during slow afternoons, experimenting with spice combinations that brought complexity to simple dishes, perfecting techniques that satisfied her own standards even when they went unnoticed by others. She created mental catalogs of successful meals, storing memories of perfect flavor, combinations, and guest reactions that validated her skills, even in the absence of direct acknowledgement. The kitchen radio became a faithful companion, providing background music that lifted her spirits during long preparation sessions. She favored Spanish-language stations that reminded her of her roots, but would switch to classical music when preparing for formal events, letting the elegant compositions guide her hands as she crafted presentations worthy of the crystal and china that would frame her work. These musical interludes created pockets of joy in days that might otherwise have felt like extended exercises in endurance. Through it all, Rosa maintained her professional standards with the dedication of someone who understood that excellence was its own reward, even when external recognition was scarce. Every meal was prepared with attention to detail that would have impressed culinary school instructors, every presentation crafted with an artist's eye for color and composition. She refused to let dismissal diminish the quality of her work, understanding instinctively that maintaining her own standards was the only way to preserve her self-respect in an environment that offered so little external validation. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each day adding weight to Rosa's experience while slowly eroding the hope that circumstances might improve. She watched Victor's fortune grow through strategic investments and market timing, observed Margaret's social influence expand through charitable work and networking, witnessed Emily's growth from toddler to curious child to school-age visitor, whose appearances became increasingly rare as academic and social commitments filled her calendar. Yet, Rosa remained constant. The steady heartbeat of a household that functioned smoothly precisely because her presence was reliable. She adapted to changing dietary preferences, mastered new cooking techniques, incorporated trendy ingredients into menus while maintaining the classical foundations that had made her indispensable. Her value was measured not in portfolios or properties, but in the seamless operation of daily life that allowed others to focus on accumulating wealth and influence without worrying about the fundamental need for nourishment and care. The penthouse kitchen witnessed countless dinner parties where Rosa's creations were praised by guests who never learned her name, board meetings where her catering enabled deal-making worth millions of dollars, family celebrations where her traditional recipes provided the foundation for new memories. She became the ghost in the machine, essential to operation but invisible to acknowledgement, her contributions as fundamental and as overlooked as the electrical systems that powered the gleaming appliances she commanded with such skill. In quiet moments, when the demanding pace of service allowed for brief reflection, Rosa sometimes wondered what her grandmother would think of the life she had built. Would Abuela approve of the compromise between dignity and security that defined Rosa's daily existence? Would she understand the choice to accept invisibility in exchange for stability? These questions had no easy answers, but they provided companionship during the long hours when Rosa was surrounded by luxury but isolated from genuine human connection. The kitchen held secrets that only Rosa knew, which pan produced the most even heat for delicate sauces, which shelf in the walk-in refrigerator maintained the perfect temperature for aging cheese, which combination of herbs created the signature flavor that guests always requested but could never identify. These intimate knowledges were her private treasure, the professional expertise that no amount of money could purchase, but that her years of dedication had earned through practice and careful attention. Rosa's hands had become maps of her service, small scars from hasty knife work during rushed preparations, burns from hot pans grabbed in moments of urgency, calluses from years of gripping heavy pots and stirring thick sauces. Each mark told a story of meals prepared under pressure, of standards maintained despite fatigue, of care invested in nourishing others even when that care went unrecognized. Her hands were her tools and her testimony, physical evidence of work that left no other permanent trace. The rhythm of seasons measured Rosa's years in the Langley household. Spring brought fresh herbs from the rooftop garden and requests for lighter fare, as winter's heaviness gave way to renewal. Summer meant adapting to the family's Hampton schedule, preparing meals that could travel well and accommodate outdoor entertaining. Fall ushered in heartier dishes and the preparation for holiday entertaining that would test every skill Rosa had developed. Winter arrived with comfort food requests and the annual round of New Year's parties that required weeks of planning and days of execution. Through each cycle, Rosa maintained her standards while adapting to changing demands. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Victor's mood, adjusting menus to provide either the comfort of familiar flavors or the distraction of culinary adventure, depending on whether his investments were performing well or poorly. She mastered the art of creating meals that photographed beautifully for Margaret's social media presence while still tasting exceptional. She developed strategies for keeping Emily engaged during her increasingly brief visits, turning cooking lessons into games that created temporary bridges across the generational and class divides that separated them. The kitchen became Rosa's classroom as well as her workplace, the space where she continued learning and growing despite the limitations of her position. She studied cookbooks during slow periods, watched online tutorials when preparing for challenging dishes, experimented with techniques that pushed her skills beyond their current boundaries. This self-directed education was driven by professional pride rather than external expectation, a commitment to excellence that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with personal integrity. Rosa's relationship with food transcended the purely professional demands of her position. Cooking remained her connection to family history and cultural identity, the thread that linked her to generations of women who had expressed love through careful preparation and generous sharing. Even in the cold perfection of the Langley kitchen, she could summon the warmth of her grandmother's apartment, the laughter that had seasoned family meals, the sense of belonging that came from contributing to something larger than individual appetite. Yet the disparity between the love she invested in her work and the indifference with which it was received created a constant ache that Rosa carried like a stone in her chest. She watched her creations disappear into conversations about quarterly earnings and property acquisitions, saw her carefully crafted presentations become background to discussions of merger possibilities and estate planning. The disconnect between her investment and others' casual consumption was a daily reminder of how differently they moved through the world, how easily they discarded what she had labored to create. The financial contrast was impossible to ignore, though Rosa rarely dwelled on numbers that would only deepen her sense of disparity. Victor's investment portfolio could generate in a single day what Rosa earned in months of dedicated service. His wine collection represented more wealth than she would accumulate in a lifetime of careful saving. The casual purchase of artwork or jewelry exceeded her annual salary without requiring any consideration or sacrifice. These realities were simply facts of her environment, as accepted and unchangeable as the marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that defined the physical space of her work. Understanding her place in this economic ecosystem required a particular kind of emotional resilience that Rosa had developed through years of practice. She learned to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in external validation, to measure her worth through her own standards rather than others' acknowledgement. This internal compass became her protection against the daily reminders of class difference, the shield that allowed her to maintain dignity while serving those who possessed every advantage except the ability to create what she could make with simple ingredients and skilled hands. The kitchen windows looked out over Central Park, providing Rosa with a view of changing seasons that marked time's passage while she remained constant in her service. She watched joggers traverse familiar routes, observed the progression of light through morning and evening, noted the way weather transformed the landscape visible from her elevated vantage point. This window became her connection to a wider world, a reminder that life continued beyond the insular concerns of the penthouse, even when her own existence felt constrained by its boundaries. Rosa's uniform became both costume and armor for the role she played in the Langley household drama. The crisp white apron represented professionalism and cleanliness, but also marked her as separate from those she served. The comfortable shoes that protected her feet during long standing hours were practical necessities that also emphasized her working status. Every element of her appearance was calibrated to project competence while maintaining appropriate distance, to be present enough to serve effectively while remaining invisible enough not to intrude on the family's sense of private space. The weight of carrying others' expectations while suppressing her own needs had accumulated over the years like interest compounding in reverse, each day adding to a debt of unacknowledged worth that no amount of professional skill could repay. Rosa had learned to live with this imbalance, to find meaning in the work itself rather than in others' recognition of its value, to maintain her sense of purpose despite the constant subtle reminders that she existed at the periphery of lives she helped sustain but could never truly share. Days flowed into weeks, weeks into months, and Rosa continued her faithful service with the steadiness of someone who had found her role and committed to fulfilling it regardless of the personal cost. The kitchen remained her kingdom, the one space where her authority was absolute and her judgment trusted even when her presence was taken for granted. Here, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the ingredients of her artistry, Rosa maintained the standards that defined her character while serving those who measured worth in entirely different currencies. Time had taught Rosa that dignity was an internal treasure that couldn't be purchased or stolen, only surrendered. Despite the daily challenges to her sense of worth, despite the casual dismissals and the invisible status that defined her place in the Langley household, she had chosen to maintain her professional integrity and personal standards. This choice, made fresh each morning when she tied her apron strings and began another day of service, was perhaps the greatest victory available to someone in her position, the triumph of character over circumstance. Then came the day that would shift everything, arriving disguised as an ordinary Tuesday morning in early spring. Rosa was preparing breakfast as usual, the familiar rhythm of morning routine providing comfort in its predictability. Victor's coffee was brewing, the aroma filling the kitchen with the rich darkness he preferred. Toast was warming in the professional-grade toaster that had cost more than Rosa's monthly rent, its timer set to deliver the precise level of crispness Victor expected. The morning newspaper lay folded beside his place setting, ready to provide the market updates and political analyses that shaped his daily perspective. But this Tuesday brought an unexpected announcement that would challenge everything Rosa had learned to accept about her place in the Langley world. Victor entered the kitchen earlier than usual, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had made a decision that pleased him immensely. He moved with the confident stride of a man whose choices were rarely questioned and never overruled, his presence filling the space with the energy of barely contained excitement. "I have news," he said, addressing Rosa directly for the first time in weeks. His voice carried the tone of someone delivering information rather than sharing a confidence, the formal distance he maintained with all household staff, preventing any suggestion of genuine communication. "My nephew Henry will be staying with us for a while. He's having some difficulty adjusting to college life, and his parents thought a change of environment might help him refocus his priorities." Rosa nodded appropriately, already calculating the adjustments this news would require. Another person in the household meant modified meal preparations, additional laundry coordination, and the careful navigation of family dynamics that she had learned to anticipate and accommodate. She had met Henry briefly during holiday visits over the years, remembering him as a quiet teenager who seemed more interested in books than in the business discussions that dominated family gatherings. What Rosa couldn't anticipate was how profoundly Henry's presence would alter the carefully maintained equilibrium that had defined her years of service to the Langley family. At 19, Henry possessed his uncle's intelligence, but none of his emotional restraint, approaching the world with curiosity rather than calculation. He had inherited his grandmother's artistic sensibilities and his mother's empathy, creating a combination of traits that would prove incompatible with the penthouse's atmosphere of cultivated indifference. Henry arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a single duffel bag and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone thrust into circumstances beyond their control. Rosa watched from the kitchen as he emerged from the elevator, noting the way his eyes took in the marble and steel surfaces with something approaching dismay rather than appreciation. His movements were careful, almost apologetic, as if he feared disturbing the pristine order that surrounded him. Unlike the other family members, Henry seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of household operation. He appeared in the kitchen doorway while Rosa was preparing dinner, asking if he could watch her work rather than demanding modifications to accommodate his preferences. This simple courtesy was so unusual that Rosa initially suspected it might be a test of some kind, an assessment of her boundaries designed to evaluate her professionalism. "I've never seen anyone make pasta from scratch," Henry said, settling into the corner chair that Rosa had claimed as her own during brief rest periods. His voice carried genuine interest rather than the polite observation that might have been expected, suggesting authentic curiosity about processes he had never witnessed. "My mom always bought the expensive stuff from that Italian place near campus, but this looks completely different." Rosa found herself explaining her technique while she worked, describing the importance of proper flour selection and egg temperature in creating dough with the right texture and elasticity. Henry listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in learning, asking questions that demonstrated real engagement with the process rather than casual politeness. For the first time in years, Rosa felt like a teacher rather than simply a service provider. Their conversations began tentatively, brief exchanges during meal preparations that gradually expanded into longer discussions as Henry's curiosity overcame his initial politeness. He asked about spice combinations, cooking temperatures, the timing that allowed multiple dishes to finish simultaneously. Rosa discovered that teaching came naturally to her, that sharing knowledge brought its own satisfaction, independent of recognition or reward. Henry's questions revealed gaps in his understanding that his privileged upbringing had created. He had eaten exceptional food his entire life without understanding the skill and effort required to produce it, had taken for granted the seamless operation of households where dedicated staff anticipated every need. Rosa's explanations opened his eyes to realities that had been invisible to him, creating awareness of systems and people he had never bothered to notice. "You know," Henry said one afternoon while Rosa prepared his favorite lunch, a grilled cheese sandwich made with artisanal bread and imported cheese that somehow tasted better when she crafted it than when he attempted the same combination himself. "I never realized how much work goes into making everything look effortless. At home, meals just appeared when we wanted them, but I never thought about all the preparation and timing involved." This observation pleased Rosa more than elaborate compliments from dinner guests ever had, because it represented genuine understanding rather than casual appreciation. Henry was beginning to see her work rather than simply consuming its results, recognizing the skill and dedication that his uncle and aunt had always taken for granted. Their conversations became the highlight of Rosa's days, brief interludes of recognition that validated her expertise and experience. Henry's presence in the kitchen began attracting attention from other household staff who had rarely shown interest in Rosa's domain. Patricia, the housekeeper, started lingering during her routine cleanings, curious about the animated conversations she overheard. Even Margaret noticed that her nephew seemed happier and more engaged than he had been since his arrival, attributing his improved mood to the change of scenery without recognizing Rosa's role in his adjustment. The connection between Rosa and Henry deepened as spring progressed into early summer. He began arriving in the kitchen before she started breakfast preparations, eager to learn new techniques and to continue conversations that had been interrupted by the previous day's obligations. Rosa taught him to crack eggs cleanly, to judge the doneness of meat without cutting into it, to taste sauces and adjust seasoning with confidence rather than guesswork. More importantly, Henry began to understand food as Rosa did, as a language of care and connection rather than simply fuel for biological functions. He learned to recognize the love that Rosa folded into every meal, the attention and intention that transformed simple ingredients into expressions of nurturing that his family had been consuming unconsciously for years. This recognition was a gift that Rosa had never expected to receive, validation of the emotional investment she made in her work despite its lack of acknowledgement. "My uncle doesn't know how lucky he is," Henry said one afternoon, while Rosa taught him to fold wontons with the precision she had learned from a Chinese cook who had worked briefly for another family years earlier. His hands were clumsy with unfamiliarity, but his effort was genuine, and Rosa found his attempts endearing in their determination. "I mean, he's got all this money and these investments, but he doesn't really taste what he's eating. It's like he's consuming fuel instead of enjoying food." This observation touched the heart of Rosa's frustration with her position, the disconnect between what she offered and what was received. Henry's growing awareness of this gap validated feelings Rosa had carried silently for years, providing external confirmation of the internal experiences she had begun to doubt. His recognition didn't change her circumstances, but it offered the possibility that her work had meaning beyond its functional necessity. The relationship between Rosa and Henry represented a new kind of challenge to the established order of the penthouse household. Victor noticed his nephew's frequent presence in the kitchen with mild disapproval, viewing it as another sign of Henry's failure to appreciate serious pursuits. Margaret worried that too much time spent with staff might give Henry inappropriate ideas about social boundaries and proper behavior. Neither understood that Henry was receiving an education in empathy and recognition that his expensive schools had never provided. Rosa began looking forward to Henry's visits with an anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. Their conversations had become a bright thread woven through days that had previously felt monotonous in their similarity. Henry's questions challenged her to articulate knowledge she had always carried intuitively, forcing her to examine techniques and approaches she had internalized through years of practice. Teaching him required her to understand her own expertise in new ways, creating opportunities for growth she hadn't experienced since her early years of learning. The cooking lessons became collaborative experiments as Henry's confidence grew, and Rosa's trust in his abilities developed. They worked together on increasingly complex dishes, Henry following Rosa's guidance while adding his own observations and suggestions. His youthful enthusiasm reminded Rosa of her own early excitement about food, rekindling passion that had been dampened by years of serving people who treated her creations as nothing more than expected amenities. Summer arrived with its usual demands for lighter fare and outdoor entertaining, but this year, Rosa had help that made the workload feel less burdensome. Henry proved surprisingly useful in meal preparation, his quick mind grasping concepts Rosa had expected to require weeks of explanation. He learned to anticipate her needs, preparing ingredients while she focused on more complex tasks, maintaining cleanliness standards that met Rosa's exacting requirements without constant supervision. Their partnership attracted increasing attention from family members who began noticing improvements in meal quality and presentation that they attributed to Rosa's suddenly enhanced performance, rather than recognizing Henry's contributions. Victor complimented dishes he had previously ignored. Margaret praised creativity she had never acknowledged before, and Emily, during her summer visits, declared that everything tasted better than she remembered from previous years. Rosa understood that Henry's presence had elevated her work in ways that went beyond simple assistance. Having someone who appreciated her efforts and recognized her skill had restored confidence that Rosa hadn't realized she had lost. She found herself taking creative risks that had seemed unnecessary when cooking for people who consumed her food without attention, experimenting with combinations and presentations that reflected her full abilities, rather than simply meeting basic expectations. The transformation was visible to everyone except the person most responsible for creating it. Henry didn't recognize how profoundly his interest and appreciation had affected Rosa's approach to her work, didn't understand that his genuine enthusiasm had rekindled passion that had been slowly dimming under years of neglect. He simply enjoyed their time together, valued the skills he was learning, and appreciated the warmth he found in the kitchen that was absent from other areas of the penthouse. As summer progressed toward its end and Henry's return to college approached, Rosa found herself dreading the return to solitary work that had once seemed normal, but now felt like impending isolation. The kitchen would lose its sense of collaboration and shared purpose, reverting to the functional space it had been before Henry's arrival. Their conversations had become essential to Rosa's daily satisfaction, providing meaning that transcended the simple completion of required tasks. Henry seemed equally reluctant to end their partnership, asking increasingly detailed questions about techniques and recipes, as if trying to store up knowledge that would sustain him during their separation. He had grown genuinely fond of Rosa, recognizing in her the kind teacher and patient mentor he had never found in formal educational settings. Their relationship had evolved beyond simple cooking instruction into genuine friendship, despite the age and class differences that should have made such connection impossible. The approaching separation created urgency that led to longer conversations and more complex cooking projects. Rosa taught Henry to prepare dishes that would allow him to recreate tastes that had become meaningful to him, recipes that would serve as connections to their shared time when distance made regular contact impossible. She wrote down instructions with unusual care, knowing that her notes would need to substitute for her presence when Henry attempted these preparations alone. "I wish I could take you with me," Henry said one afternoon, while they prepared what they both knew might be their final collaborative meal. His voice carried the genuine regret of someone losing something valuable, recognition that their time together had created something worth preserving despite its unconventional nature. "College food is terrible, and the cooking facilities in the dorm are pretty much useless. I'm going to miss this." Rosa felt tears threaten at the acknowledgement of loss, the recognition that their connection had meaning for Henry as well as for her. She had grown attached to her young student in ways that surprised her with their intensity, had come to look forward to his questions and observations as the highlight of each day. His departure would create an absence that couldn't be filled by resumed routine or professional satisfaction. The last week of summer brought preparations for Henry's departure and Rosa's return to solitary service. The kitchen felt different even before he left, charged with the awareness that their collaboration was ending and that the dynamic that had made recent months so rewarding would soon be only a memory. Rosa found herself memorizing details of their interactions, storing up moments that might provide comfort during the lonely period ahead. Henry's final morning in the penthouse arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, the season's change-marking transitions that extended beyond weather. Rosa prepared his favorite breakfast with extra care, knowing that it would be months before she would cook specifically for someone who appreciated not just the results, but the process itself. Their conversation over the meal was subdued, both recognizing that their unusual friendship would need to adapt to distance and different circumstances. "Thank you," Henry said as he prepared to leave for the airport, his words carrying weight that transcended politeness. He hugged Rosa impulsively, an embrace that violated every protocol of staff-family relationships, but felt entirely appropriate given what they had shared. "You taught me more than just cooking. You taught me to notice things I never paid attention to before, to appreciate work that I always took for granted." Rosa watched him leave with mixed emotions, pride in what she had taught him, sadness at his departure, and uncertainty about how his absence would affect her daily experience of work that had been transformed by his presence. The kitchen felt empty even before the elevator doors closed, the silence emphasizing how much their conversations had meant to her during the months of their collaboration. The return to routine was more difficult than Rosa had anticipated. Preparing meals for Victor and Margaret without Henry's assistance and appreciation highlighted how mechanical her work had become before his arrival, how much of her professional satisfaction had derived from having someone recognize and value her contributions. The kitchen, which had felt alive with possibility during their partnership, reverted to being simply a workplace where she performed expected duties for people who consumed her efforts without acknowledgement. Days passed with the steady rhythm Rosa had known for years before Henry's visit, but now the repetition felt hollow rather than comforting. She found herself listening for footsteps that wouldn't come, preparing extra portions out of habit, before remembering that Henry was no longer there to share meals and conversations. The silence stretched longer than it had before, emphasizing her isolation in ways that previous solitude had never affected her. Victor seemed oblivious to any change in household dynamics, continuing his pattern of consuming meals without comment or appreciation. Margaret maintained her distant politeness, offering no recognition of improved quality that she had praised during Henry's visit. The temporary elevation that had made Rosa's work feel valued and meaningful disappeared as if it had never existed, leaving behind only memories of what recognition could feel like when it was genuine. The loneliness was sharper now because Rosa knew what she was missing. Before Henry's visit, she had accepted isolation as a natural part of her role, the price of serving people who existed in different social and economic spheres. Now, she understood how much more satisfying work could be when someone cared about the process and appreciated the skill involved, when cooking became teaching and service became collaboration. Weeks passed before Rosa received her first letter from Henry, a long handwritten note that described his attempts to recreate dishes they had prepared together and his newfound awareness of food quality in institutional settings. His descriptions of cafeteria meals and fellow students' attitudes toward food made Rosa smile despite her continued sadness at their separation, providing evidence that their time together had created lasting change in his perspective and appreciation. Henry's letters became regular occurrences, arriving every few weeks with updates on his college experience and requests for additional recipes or cooking advice. Rosa treasured these communications, reading and rereading them until she had memorized his accounts of small victories and humorous failures in his attempts to cook for himself and friends. Their correspondence provided ongoing connection that helped sustain her through the return to solitary work. The exchange of letters also gave Rosa something she had never experienced in her years of service, recognition of her expertise from someone whose education and social position would typically place him far above her standing. Henry's requests for advice and his descriptions of sharing her recipes with friends validated her knowledge in ways that formal recognition never could have accomplished, confirming that what she had taught him had genuine value beyond their personal relationship. Rosa began planning for Henry's next visit, even as she adjusted to his absence, imagining new dishes they might explore together and techniques she could teach him during their next extended time together. These anticipatory plans provided purpose that made her daily routine more bearable, creating future goals that transcended the simple completion of required tasks that had previously defined her professional satisfaction. The kitchen gradually resumed its former quiet efficiency, but Rosa carried within her the knowledge that connection was possible even across the social divides that had previously seemed insurmountable. Henry's friendship had shown her that recognition and appreciation could exist within the constraints of her position, that teaching and learning could flourish even in relationships defined by service and class difference. This understanding changed how Rosa approached her work, even in Henry's absence. She maintained higher standards not because they were required, but because she had rediscovered pride in her craft through sharing it with someone who valued both the process and the results. Her renewed sense of purpose was internal rather than dependent on external validation, sustainable in ways that recognition from others could never have been. The correspondence with Henry continued throughout the fall and into winter, their letters creating ongoing dialogue about food, technique, and the broader questions about work and worth that their relationship had raised. Rosa found herself articulating ideas she had never put into words, examining her own experience with new clarity as she explained her perspective to someone genuinely interested in understanding her point of view. Winter brought its usual demands for hearty comfort foods and elaborate holiday entertaining. But this year, Rosa approached these challenges with renewed energy and creativity inspired by her teaching experience with Henry. She experimented with preparations they had discussed in their letters, refining techniques based on his feedback and questions, maintaining their collaboration across the distance that separated them. The Langley family's holiday celebrations proceeded with their customary elegance and efficiency, Rosa's contributions providing the foundation for gatherings that reinforced family traditions and social connections. Her excellent service was taken for granted, as always, but Rosa no longer felt diminished by this lack of recognition, because she carried within herself the knowledge of her own worth that Henry's friendship had helped her rediscover. As winter progressed toward spring and the anniversary of Henry's first arrival approached, Rosa found herself looking forward to his next visit with anticipation that had been missing from her personal calendar for years. The prospect of resumed collaboration and continued learning provided goals that transcended her daily responsibilities, creating personal investment in future possibilities that made present challenges more manageable. The knowledge that someone valued her expertise and appreciated her dedication had become a permanent part of Rosa's internal landscape, a source of strength that didn't depend on daily reinforcement because it was based on genuine connection rather than professional obligation. Henry's recognition had awakened Rosa's understanding of her own worth, providing foundation for self-respect that would sustain her regardless of how others treated her contributions. This transformation was perhaps the greatest gift of their unlikely friendship, not just the temporary pleasure of being appreciated, but the lasting knowledge that appreciation was possible and that her work had value that transcended its functional necessity. Rosa had learned to see herself through eyes that recognized skill and dedication, to value her own expertise independent of external validation. The daily routines continued with their familiar rhythm, but Rosa approached them with renewed purpose that made even mundane tasks feel meaningful. She had rediscovered passion for her craft through the experience of sharing it, had remembered that cooking could be joyful as well as professional, creative as well as functional. These insights would remain with her long after Henry's visits ended, permanent changes in perspective that enriched her relationship with her work. Spring returned with its promise of renewal and the expectation of Henry's visit during his college break, bringing with it the anticipation of resumed collaboration and continued learning. Rosa prepared for his arrival with excitement she hadn't felt in years, planning new techniques to teach him and dishes they could explore together, looking forward to conversations that would challenge and inspire them both. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, Rosa approached it with understanding of what was possible when connection transcended traditional boundaries, when teaching became learning and service became friendship. She carried within herself the knowledge that recognition and appreciation existed, even in environments where they seemed impossible. Waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond surface appearances, to acknowledge the skill and dedication that made comfortable life possible. But just as Rosa began to hope that her situation might be permanently improved by the connection she had found with Henry, circumstances were preparing to test everything she had learned about her own worth and the value of the work she performed with such dedication. The stability she had built around Henry's recognition was about to face challenges that would require all the inner strength their friendship had helped her discover. Victor had been quietly considering changes to household operations that would dramatically affect Rosa's position, decisions driven by financial considerations rather than recognition of her contributions. His business advisors had recommended cost-cutting measures that included reducing domestic staff expenses, part of a broader strategy to optimize cash flow for new investment opportunities in emerging cryptocurrency markets and international real estate ventures. The penthouse had become symbolic of lifestyle expenses that Victor's accountants viewed as unnecessarily extravagant, arguing that simpler arrangements could provide adequate comfort while freeing significant capital for more profitable investments. Rosa's salary, while modest by the standards of their household budget, represented exactly the kind of ongoing expense that financial advisors targeted when seeking to improve portfolio performance through operational efficiency. These discussions were taking place in boardrooms and private offices, far from the kitchen, where Rosa continued her daily service, unaware that her position was being evaluated through spreadsheets that reduced her years of dedication to line items and budget analyses. The human element of her contribution was invisible to financial calculations that measured only costs without considering the intangible value of reliability, skill, and care. The irony was profound. Just as Rosa had rediscovered appreciation for her work through Henry's recognition, the economic forces that drove Victor's decision-making were preparing to eliminate her position entirely. The timing would prove particularly cruel, arriving just as Rosa had begun to hope that her situation might evolve in positive directions rather than simply continuing with familiar limitations. The first indication of coming change arrived through subtle shifts in household routine rather than direct communication about Rosa's future. Victor began working longer hours, spending more time in meetings with financial advisors and less time in the penthouse where he might have noticed the quality of service Rosa provided. Margaret became increasingly absorbed in social obligations that took her away from home, reducing her already minimal interaction with household staff. These changes created an atmosphere of distraction and distance that made Rosa's daily experience feel less secure even before she understood the specific threats developing to her position. The family members who consumed her cooking seemed increasingly disconnected from the domestic sphere she managed so carefully, their attention focused on external pursuits that made her contributions feel more peripheral than essential. Rosa noticed these shifts without understanding their significance, interpreting them as temporary fluctuations in family dynamics rather than signs of deeper changes in priorities and plans. Her focus remained on maintaining service standards and preparing for Henry's expected visit, unaware that the foundation of stability she had assumed for years was being systematically undermined by decisions made in contexts where her value was measured only in financial terms. The contrast between her personal growth through connection with Henry and the brewing threats to her employment created tension Rosa couldn't identify but definitely felt. Her renewed sense of purpose and professional pride was developing just as external forces were aligning to eliminate the position that had provided both financial security and the platform for her newly discovered role as teacher and mentor. This emerging conflict between internal transformation and external threat would soon explode into crisis that would test every insight Rosa had gained about her own worth and every relationship she had built within the Langley household. The recognition she had finally found would have to sustain her through challenges that would threaten not just her employment, but her sense of place in a world that had never offered easy answers about dignity, worth, and the value of work performed with dedication despite its lack of acknowledgement. The spring air carried promises of renewal that Rosa couldn't have known would be tested by events already set in motion, decisions made in boardrooms where she existed only as a budget line rather than as the skilled professional who had devoted years to creating comfort and sustenance for people who barely knew her name. The education and appreciation that Henry had provided would soon be measured against lessons in dismissal that would prove whether Rosa's newfound sense of worth could survive the kind of systematic devaluation that had always threatened workers whose entire security depended on the whims of those they served. Then came the morning that changed everything, arriving with the deceptive normalcy that conceals life-altering moments until they explode into awareness with devastating clarity. Rosa was preparing breakfast as she had thousands of times before, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through routines that had become second nature over years of service. The kitchen was filled with familiar aromas, coffee brewing to Victor's exacting standards, toast warming to the precise degree of crispness he preferred, eggs prepared with the attention to detail that marked all of Rosa's work. But this morning brought an announcement that would shatter the stability Rosa had worked years to build and had recently begun to appreciate through Henry's recognition of her worth. Victor entered the kitchen with an energy that immediately felt different, carrying the particular tension of someone about to deliver news that would significantly alter established arrangements. His expression was businesslike rather than personal, the look of someone making a calculated decision rather than sharing information with someone whose feelings might matter. "I've made some changes to our household arrangements," Victor said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used for business communications rather than the casual dismissal that characterized his usual interactions with staff. "We'll be hosting a significant event next month. Potential investors interested in our new cryptocurrency ventures. I've hired Jean-Claude Dubois to handle the catering. He's one of the most sought-after chefs in the city." Rosa felt her stomach tighten with apprehension even before Victor continued, sensing that his announcement contained implications beyond simple event planning. Jean-Claude Dubois was renowned throughout New York's culinary scene, a celebrity chef whose restaurants commanded months-long reservation lists and whose private event services cost more than Rosa earned in several months. His involvement suggested changes that went far beyond normal household entertaining. "Jean-Claude will need full access to the kitchen for preparations," Victor continued, his words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond their immediate impact. "You'll need to coordinate with his team to ensure they have everything they require. This event is crucial for securing funding for expansion into international markets, particularly our Bitcoin mining operations in Eastern Europe." The phrase, "coordinate with his team," carried undertones that Rosa recognized with growing dread. She had witnessed similar arrangements before, in previous positions, when temporary celebrity chef involvement had gradually evolved into permanent displacement of existing staff. The language was carefully chosen to sound collaborative while actually describing subordination, positioning Rosa as support staff for someone else's operation rather than as the primary professional responsible for kitchen operations. Rosa nodded appropriately, maintaining the professional composure that had served her well through years of receiving unwelcome news and unexpected demands. But internally, she was calculating the implications of sharing her kitchen with a celebrity chef whose reputation depended partly on dismissing the kind of traditional home cooking that had been Rosa's specialty. Jean-Claude was known for molecular gastronomy and avant-garde presentations that treated food as art project rather than nourishment, the antithesis of everything Rosa valued about cooking. "The event will showcase our success in diversifying investment portfolios beyond traditional stock market holdings," Victor explained, his enthusiasm for the business implications evident in his voice. "Our returns on cryptocurrency investments alone have exceeded 200% over the past 18 months, and we're positioning to expand operations into gold mining and international property development. The catering needs to reflect our sophistication and success." These financial details emphasize the stakes involved in arrangements that would determine Rosa's future role in the household, making clear that her position was secondary to business objectives that measured worth only in terms of profits and investment returns. The event would serve as demonstration of Victor's financial acumen, with every detail calculated to impress potential partners whose own wealth existed in similar realms of multi-million-dollar portfolios and international asset management. Rosa understood, with the clarity that comes from years of reading subtle cues and unspoken implications, that her role in this arrangement would be fundamentally different from her normal function as head of kitchen operations. She would be reduced to supporting someone else's vision, her expertise subordinated to Jean-Claude's celebrity status, regardless of their relative skills or understanding of what cooking could and should accomplish. The next few days brought a parade of deliveries and setup activities that transformed Rosa's familiar kitchen into something she barely recognized. Jean-Claude's team arrived with equipment that looked more suited to scientific research than food preparation: molecular gastronomy tools, precision instruments, and specialized appliances that required constant calibration and monitoring. The warm efficiency Rosa had cultivated over years of service was replaced by clinical precision that treated cooking as laboratory experiment rather than human nourishment. Jean-Claude himself was everything Rosa had expected from his reputation and feared from the implications of his hiring. Tall, imperious, and dismissively arrogant, he surveyed Rosa's kitchen with the expression of someone evaluating territory to be conquered rather than collaborative space to be shared. His first words to Rosa were instructions rather than introductions, orders delivered without acknowledgement of her experience or status as the person who had managed this kitchen successfully for years. "You will handle basic prep work and cleanup," he announced, his French accent adding theatrical flourish to pronouncements that redefined Rosa's role without consultation or consideration. "My team requires absolute precision in ingredient preparation. Any deviation from our specifications could compromise the entire event. This is not the time for improvisation or personal interpretation." The condescension was obvious and intentional, designed to establish hierarchy that placed Rosa firmly in a subordinate position despite her superior knowledge of kitchen operations and family preferences. Jean-Claude's approach treated her as unskilled labor rather than the experienced professional she had proven herself to be through years of excellent service, reducing her to assistant status in her own domain. Rosa bit back responses that would only have worsened her situation, maintaining professional dignity while internally struggling with rage and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had never experienced such blatant dismissal of her expertise, never been so clearly told that her years of skill development and dedicated service counted for nothing in evaluations that mattered to her employers. The days that followed were torture disguised as work, as Rosa found herself reduced to performing menial tasks under the supervision of Jean-Claude's assistants, who treated her with the casual dismissal reserved for temporary help. She chopped vegetables to specifications that ignored optimal techniques she had perfected over decades, prepared ingredients according to methods that wasted both flavor potential and natural textures, and cleaned equipment. She wasn't allowed to operate despite her superior familiarity with its proper use. The contrast between her normal autonomy and her current subordination was made more painful by recent memories of Henry's appreciation for her expertise and recognition of her skills. Just weeks earlier, she had been teaching complex techniques to someone who valued her knowledge. Now she was being treated as if she possessed no relevant experience worth acknowledging. The whiplash between recognition and dismissal was emotionally devastating in ways that consistent neglect might not have been. Jean-Claude's menu selections revealed everything Rosa needed to know about the gulf between his approach to food and her own philosophy of cooking. His dishes were architectural constructions that prioritized visual impact over flavor, molecular experiments that impressed through novelty rather than nourishment. Each plate was designed to photograph beautifully for social media rather than to satisfy hunger or provide comfort, treating food as performance art rather than fundamental human need. Rosa watched these preparations with growing dismay, recognizing that everything she valued about cooking was being systematically eliminated in favor of pretension that served no purpose beyond demonstrating expensive sophistication. The event would showcase wealth and status rather than hospitality, leaving guests impressed but not nourished, dazzled by presentation but not sustained by substance. The personal insults began almost immediately and escalated as the event approached, Jean-Claude's cruelty seemingly motivated by genuine malice rather than simple professional dismissal. He criticized Rosa's knife skills despite their obvious excellence, mocked her accent when she asked clarification questions, and made pointed comments about untrained help that were clearly designed for her to overhear and internalize. Perhaps in whatever provincial kitchen you learned such habits, these methods were acceptable, he said with theatrical disdain, while correcting her preparation of vegetables that met every professional standard. But refined cuisine requires precision you may never have encountered before. Try to follow instructions exactly rather than relying on whatever improvisation you consider adequate. Each insult was calculated to undermine Rosa's confidence and establish Jean-Claude's superiority through humiliation rather than demonstration of actual superior skill. Rosa recognized the tactics as those of someone whose own insecurity required constant reinforcement through the diminishment of others, but understanding the psychology didn't reduce the emotional impact of sustained attack on her professional competence and personal worth. The other household staff watched these interactions with the careful neutrality of people who understood that aligning with either side could jeopardize their own positions. Patricia, the housekeeper, maintained professional distance that protected her from involvement in conflicts that might affect her employment security. The groundskeeper and maintenance staff found reasons to avoid the kitchen entirely, recognizing that the tension created risks for anyone who might inadvertently choose wrong sides in power struggles beyond their control. Rosa's isolation was complete in ways it had never been before, cut off from the normal support systems that might have provided comfort during periods of professional stress. Henry was away at college, his letters providing only distant encouragement that couldn't address immediate crises. The family members who consumed her cooking remained oblivious to kitchen dynamics that didn't affect their daily comfort, focused on business concerns and social obligations that made domestic staff conflicts irrelevant to their attention. The preparation period stretched on with increasing intensity as the event date approached, each day bringing new humiliations and fresh demonstrations of Rosa's reduced status in arrangements she had no power to change. She endured criticism of work that exceeded professional standards, accepted blame for problems she hadn't created, and maintained dignity while being systematically stripped of authority she had earned through years of excellent service. Sleep became elusive as Rosa spent nights replaying the day's interactions and dreading tomorrow's continuation of treatment that violated every principle of professional respect she had learned to expect from competent colleagues. Her apartment, once a refuge where she could recover from workplace stress, became merely another location for worrying about tomorrow's challenges and questioning whether she possessed the strength to continue enduring systematic devaluation of everything she had worked to accomplish. The event itself was scheduled for a Saturday evening, allowing full-day preparation that would showcase Jean-Claude's elaborate presentations to investors whose approval could determine funding for Victor's expansion into international markets. Rosa understood that her performance during these preparations would be scrutinized not just by Jean-Claude, but by Victor, who would evaluate her usefulness in future arrangements based on how well she adapted to subordinate status under celebrity chef supervision. The morning of the event arrived with spring rain that matched Rosa's mood, gray skies reflecting the emotional weather that had settled over her during weeks of preparation under Jean-Claude's dismissive supervision. She arrived earlier than required, hoping to complete some preparations before the celebrity chef's team arrived and began their customary routine of criticism and correction designed to emphasize her inferior status in arrangements that continued to define her as support staff rather than professional colleague. But this morning would bring challenges that exceeded even Rosa's pessimistic expectations, events that would test not just her professional skills, but her personal resilience in ways that would determine whether the recognition Henry had helped her discover could survive systematic attempts to destroy her sense of worth through public humiliation and professional sabotage. The catastrophe began with something as simple as a broken wine bottle, but its consequences would ripple through Rosa's life like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would threaten to drown everything she had worked to build and recently learned to value about herself and her contributions to the household she served with such dedicated excellence despite their failure to appreciate her worth. Jean-Claude discovered the broken bottle of Chateau Margaux in the wine storage area, its deep red contents spreading across the temperature-controlled floor like spilled blood, the label indicating a vintage worth more than Rosa earned in several months of dedicated service. The destruction was immediately obvious and immediately expensive, representing exactly the kind of loss that would demand explanation, accountability, and consequences that could affect Rosa's employment and reputation permanently. "This is exactly what I expected from untrained help," Jean-Claude announced loudly enough for the entire kitchen staff to hear, his voice carrying theatrical outrage designed for maximum impact rather than simple communication of discovered damage. Carelessness with inventory. This valuable demonstrates exactly why serious events require professional oversight rather than reliance on whatever domestic help happens to be available. Rosa stared at the broken glass with growing horror, not because she had caused the damage, but because she immediately understood how the situation would be interpreted regardless of actual responsibility. The timing was perfect for Jean-Claude's purposes and disastrous for her position, providing exactly the kind of dramatic evidence he needed to justify her dismissal and his complete control over kitchen operations going forward. "I didn't break that bottle," Rosa said quietly, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest as she recognized the trap that was closing around her with devastating precision. "I wasn't even in the wine storage area this morning. I've been working on vegetable preparation since I arrived." Her defense was accurate but irrelevant to Jean-Claude's agenda, which required a scapegoat for problems that would inevitably arise during complex event preparation. Rosa's denial only provided additional evidence of unreliability. Her truthful explanation transformed into defensive lying that supposedly demonstrated guilt rather than innocence. "Of course you would deny responsibility," Jean-Claude replied, with the satisfied tone of someone whose expectations were being fulfilled exactly as predicted. But who else had access to wine storage? Who else was working alone in areas where such carelessness could occur without supervision? The evidence speaks for itself. The accusation was particularly cruel because it exploited Rosa's isolation and independent work style as evidence of guilt, transforming the self-sufficiency that had always been her strength into supposed proof of careless behavior. Her years of trustworthy service became irrelevant to evaluations that began with assumed guilt and worked backward to construct supporting evidence. Victor arrived in the kitchen just as the argument was escalating, drawn by voices raised in conflict that threatened the smooth preparation essential to evening success. His expression immediately registered displeasure at finding disruption in arrangements that were supposed to proceed with clockwork precision, his business priorities making Jean-Claude's version of events more credible than Rosa's truthful but inconvenient denial. "What's the problem here?" Victor asked, his tone indicating that he wanted resolution rather than investigation, quick elimination of whatever complication was threatening his important event, rather than careful evaluation of competing claims about responsibility for expensive damage. Jean-Claude's explanation was expertly calibrated to Victor's priorities and prejudices, emphasizing the financial loss and the threat to evening success while positioning himself as the competent professional dealing with problems created by inadequate support staff. His account painted Rosa as the obvious source of troubles that required immediate decisive action to prevent additional complications. This kind of carelessness with valuable inventory cannot be tolerated when we're preparing for guests whose investment decisions could be influenced by any sign of operational problems, Jean-Claude concluded, his words hitting precisely the concerns that would motivate Victor's decision-making process. Professional events require professional standards throughout all levels of staff performance. Rosa watched Victor's face during this explanation, seeing her fate being decided through calculations that weighed her years of loyal service against the immediate convenience of accepting Jean-Claude's version of events without investigation. The business stakes made her expendable, her value as long-term employee far less important than avoiding any risk of embarrassment in front of potential investors. "Rosa," "I'm extremely disappointed," Victor said, his words hitting like physical blows despite their quiet delivery. "Your carelessness has created exactly the kind of problem we can't afford today. I think it would be best if you collected your things and left immediately. We'll discuss your final arrangements after the event concludes successfully." The dismissal was swift and final, delivered without opportunity for defense or explanation that might complicate Victor's preferred narrative of the situation. Rosa felt the world shift around her as security she had assumed for years evaporated in moments, her position eliminated through accusation she couldn't defend against judges who preferred convenient fiction to inconvenient truth. "But I didn't," Rosa began, her voice catching as she realized the truth was irrelevant to decisions already made, based on priorities that placed her worth far below business convenience and social appearance. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary," Victor interrupted, his tone carrying the finality of someone whose patience was already exhausted by complications he wanted eliminated rather than resolved. "Jean-Claude has important preparations to complete, and your continued presence would only create additional disruption." Rosa felt tears threatening as the magnitude of injustice settled over her like a suffocating blanket, the realization that everything she had worked for could be destroyed so easily through accusations she had no power to disprove. The kitchen that had been her domain for years suddenly felt foreign and hostile, transformed from workplace to scene of elimination that would affect every aspect of her future security and professional identity. She untied her apron with hands that trembled despite her efforts to maintain dignity, the simple action marking the end of hopes and expectations that had sustained her through years of unrecognized service. The apron represented more than uniform. It was symbol of expertise and dedication that was being discarded along with her employment, treated as disposable despite the care and skill it had represented. The walk to her locker felt like a funeral march, each step carrying her further from stability and deeper into uncertainty that would affect not just her immediate circumstances, but her long-term prospects for employment in a field where references and reputation determined opportunities. The other staff members watched her departure with expressions that mixed sympathy with relief that they were not facing similar elimination, their silence emphasizing Rosa's complete isolation in facing consequences she didn't deserve. Her personal belongings fit into a single cardboard box, the accumulation of years reduced to a few photographs, some cooking utensils she had purchased herself, and the letters from Henry that had provided such comfort during recent months. The physical evidence of her presence in the Langley household was pathetically small, easily erased without leaving any trace of the dedication and excellence she had brought to her work. The service elevator carried Rosa down from the penthouse for the last time, its familiar mechanical sounds creating soundtrack for the ending of a chapter she had never imagined would conclude so abruptly or unjustly. The building lobby felt different now that she was no longer entering it as an employee with legitimate business, transformed into threshold between her past security and uncertain future that stretched ahead without clear direction or reliable support. The subway ride to her apartment passed in a haze of shock and grief, the familiar route now leading not to rest between workdays, but to unemployment that would require immediate decisions about how to survive financially while searching for new employment in a field where her sudden departure from previous position would require explanation she couldn't provide without seeming defensive or unreliable. Her small studio apartment felt like a prison cell when she entered carrying the cardboard box that represented everything she'd been allowed to take from years of service to people who had discarded her like damaged merchandise. The space that had been refuge now became the entirety of her world, boundaries that emphasized how completely her circumstances had changed in the span of a few devastating hours. Rosa sat on her second-hand sofa and finally allowed the tears she had suppressed throughout the morning's humiliation and dismissal, crying for the injustice of false accusations, the cruelty of employers who had used her skill and dedication without developing any loyalty or appreciation that might have protected her when protection was needed. and the uncertain future that stretched ahead without the financial security her position had provided. The afternoon passed in a fog of disbelief and practical concerns, the emotional impact of dismissal competing with immediate needs for budgeting reduced income and beginning the job search process that would determine whether Rosa could remain in New York or would need to relocate to less expensive areas where her savings might last longer while she sought new employment opportunities. Evening came with the knowledge that the event she had helped prepare was proceeding without her. Jean-Claude's molecular gastronomy presentations impressing investors who would never know that Rosa's dismissal had been based on false accusations designed to eliminate someone whose presence was inconvenient to celebrity chefs' complete control over kitchen operations. The injustice was compounded by the certainty that the evening would be deemed successful despite her absence, her years of contribution already forgotten in the satisfaction of accomplished business objectives. Sleep was impossible that first night, Rosa's mind cycling through replays of the morning's events, alternative responses she might have made, and desperate strategies for somehow proving her innocence and reclaiming her position. But she knew from experience with previous employers that dismissals were rarely reversed, that admitting error would require humility that people like Victor were incapable of displaying toward someone they considered so far beneath their social status. The next few days brought a parade of practical challenges that highlighted how completely Rosa's circumstances had changed through events beyond her control or prediction. Unemployment benefits would provide only minimal support, far less than needed to maintain even her modest lifestyle. Her savings were adequate for several months of basic expenses, but not sufficient to cushion the extended job search that might be required to find position comparable to what she had lost. The job search revealed how much Rosa's sudden departure had damaged her prospects for equivalent employment with other wealthy families who demanded references and background checks that would reveal her abrupt dismissal without providing opportunities to explain the circumstances that had led to false accusations. Her years of excellent service became irrelevant to evaluations that focused on her most recent employment ending, the single negative data point that overshadowed everything positive she had previously accomplished. Rosa's professional reputation, built over decades of dedicated service, was crumbling under the weight of accusations she couldn't disprove in dismissal. She couldn't explain without seeming to make excuses that potential employers would interpret as evidence of unreliability or difficult personality that made her unsuitable for positions requiring discretion and teamwork with other household staff. The isolation was perhaps more devastating than the financial insecurity, cutting Rosa off from daily purpose and human interaction that had structured her life for years. The sudden absence of routine left empty hours that stretched endlessly, filled only with worry about future prospects, and replaying past events that couldn't be changed, no matter how many times she reconsidered alternative responses she might have made. Henry's letters provided the only bright spots in days that otherwise felt like extended punishment for crimes she hadn't committed. His continued friendship and appreciation for her expertise offering emotional support that helped sustain hope when circumstances seemed entirely hopeless. His correspondence reminded Rosa that she possessed genuine skills and knowledge that had value independent of employers who failed to appreciate her contributions. But even Henry's recognition couldn't solve the practical problems that grew more pressing as days passed without employment prospects that could replace the income she had lost through false accusations and summary dismissal. Rosa faced decisions about reducing expenses, possibly relocating to less expensive housing, and accepting positions that would represent significant steps backward in her professional development and financial security. The spring that had promised renewal when Henry's visit was anticipated now felt like mockery, the season's growth and warmth contrasting sharply with Rosa's circumstances that seemed to offer only decay and uncertainty. She watched from her apartment window as other people went about their daily routines with security she had taken for granted until it disappeared so suddenly and completely. Weeks passed in a blur of unsuccessful job interviews, rejections from positions she was overqualified for, and growing desperation about finances that couldn't sustain extended unemployment indefinitely. Rose's confidence, so recently restored through Henry's appreciation, was being systematically destroyed by a job market that seemed to have no place for someone whose recent employment had ended under circumstances that couldn't be satisfactorily explained. The psychological toll was becoming as serious as the financial pressure, depression settling over Rosa like fog that obscured hope and made every small setback feel like confirmation that her situation was hopeless. She began questioning not just her prospects for future employment, but her worth as a person, wondering if perhaps the accusations against her had contained truth she was unable to acknowledge even to herself. But just as Rosa's spirits reached their lowest point, just as she began considering desperate measures like accepting positions far below her qualifications or relocating to distant cities where her diminished savings might last longer, an unexpected development would begin to shift the balance of circumstances that had seemed so completely weighted against her survival and recovery. The first hint of changing fortune came through an unexpected phone call on a Wednesday afternoon in late May, nearly 2 months after Rosa's dismissal from the Langley household. She had been mechanical, responding to another rejection from a position that would have provided less than half her previous salary, when her phone rang with a number she didn't immediately recognize but felt somehow familiar. "Rosa, this is Henry. I just got back from college and heard what happened. I can't believe Uncle Victor fired you over something you didn't even do. I've been trying to reach you since I found out, but I didn't have your phone number until now." Henry's voice carried genuine distress at learning about Rosa's situation, the kind of emotional investment in her welfare that Rosa hadn't expected from any member of the Langley family. His concern was immediately apparent, offering the first hope she had felt since her dismissal, that someone with inside knowledge might be able to help address the injustice that had destroyed her employment and damaged her reputation. "I saw the security footage," Henry continued, his words hitting Rosa like electricity as she realized their potential significance for her situation. "I was checking the cameras because some of my stuff had been moved around in my room, and I happened to look at the kitchen recordings from that morning. Rosa, you weren't even near the wine storage area when that bottle was broken. It was one of Jean-Claude's assistants who broke it, and then they just let you take the blame." The revelation was overwhelming in its implications, providing exactly the kind of evidence that could vindicate Rosa and expose the false accusations that had led to her dismissal. But it also raised questions about why such clear proof hadn't been consulted before her firing, why Victor had been so quick to accept Jean-Claude's version of events without investigating alternatives that might have prevented an innocent person from losing her livelihood. "I've been trying to convince Uncle Victor to look at the footage himself, but he's been traveling constantly for business meetings related to those cryptocurrency investments. I finally got him to sit down with me this morning and watch what actually happened. Rosa, he feels terrible about what he did to you." Rosa felt tears beginning as the magnitude of this development settled into her consciousness, the possibility that her innocence might be recognized and her professional reputation restored, offering hope that had seemed impossible just moments earlier. But she also felt anger at the injustice of suffering for weeks due to accusations that could have been disproven immediately if anyone had bothered to investigate before making decisions that affected her entire future. "He wants to see you," Henry continued. "He asked me to call and find out if you'd be willing to meet with him. I know it's probably difficult to even think about after everything that happened, but I think he genuinely wants to make things right. The security footage proves you were telling the truth about everything." The request for a meeting created conflicting emotions in Rosa, part of her wanting vindication and restoration, while another part resented that she was being asked to accommodate the schedule of someone who had dismissed her so casually based on accusations he had never bothered to investigate properly. The power imbalance remained even in apology, with Victor controlling the terms of reconciliation that should have been his obligation rather than her choice. But the practical reality was that Rosa needed her job back, needed the financial security and professional validation that had been taken from her through false accusations that the security footage could now disprove conclusively. Her personal feelings about dignity and respect were luxuries she couldn't afford when unemployment benefits were insufficient to cover basic living expenses much longer. "I'll meet with him," Rosa replied, her voice steadier than she felt as she contemplated facing the man who had destroyed her sense of security so easily and was now offering restoration with equal casual authority over her circumstances. "When does he want to see me?" The meeting was arranged for the next afternoon at the penthouse, returning Rosa to the scene of her humiliation under circumstances that felt surreal in their reversal of power dynamics and expectations. She dressed with the same care she had always brought to work, understanding that her appearance would affect how the conversation proceeded and how seriously her position in any resolution would be taken. The elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like traveling backward through time, returning to familiar spaces that now carried memories of injustice and dismissal alongside years of dedicated service and professional accomplishment. The marble surfaces and steel fixtures looked unchanged, but Rosa's relationship to the environment had been permanently altered by recent experiences that revealed how quickly security could disappear. Victor was waiting in the living room rather than the kitchen, the formal setting emphasizing the serious nature of their conversation, while also removing Rosa from the space where she had been most comfortable and competent. He looked older than she remembered, his face carrying stress lines that suggested the business pressures he had prioritized over careful investigation of staff conflicts had taken their own toll on his well-being. "Rosa, I owe you an apology," Victor began, his voice carrying genuine regret that seemed uncharacteristic for someone whose communication had always been marked by authority rather than vulnerability. "I made a serious mistake in dismissing you without properly investigating what happened. The security footage clearly shows that you had nothing to do with the broken wine bottle." The acknowledgement of error was significant, but Rosa noticed that it focused on investigative failure rather than the broader issues of trust and respect that had allowed false accusations to seem credible in the first place. Victor's apology addressed procedural mistakes without examining the underlying attitudes toward staff that had made Rosa's guilt seem plausible despite her years of reliable service. Jean-Claude's assistant broke the bottle during setup activities and then convinced Jean-Claude to blame you rather than accept responsibility for his team's carelessness, Victor continued, providing details that explained the conspiracy Rosa had suspected but couldn't prove during the morning of her dismissal. "I should have checked the security recordings before making any decisions about your employment." Rosa listened to these revelations with mixed emotions. Vindicated by the confirmation of her innocence, but also aware that the damage to her circumstances couldn't be simply undone through after-the-fact acknowledgments of error. She had spent weeks of unemployment, draining savings and damaging her professional reputation, while Victor traveled for business meetings that he had prioritized over investigating injustices in his own household. "I want to offer you your position back," Victor said, reaching the heart of the matter with the directness that characterized his business dealings. "Full restoration of salary, benefits, and professional status. I'll also provide bonuses to compensate for the salary you've lost during this period, and excellent references that should repair any damage this incident may have caused to your professional reputation." The offer was comprehensive in its attempt to address the practical consequences of Rosa's wrongful dismissal, but it couldn't restore the sense of security and professional confidence that had been shattered through experiences no amount of money could simply erase. Rosa had learned how easily her position could be eliminated, how quickly years of dedication could be discarded, how little protection her excellence provided against false accusations from people whose status gave them automatic credibility. "I appreciate your offer," Rosa replied carefully, understanding that her response would shape not just her immediate circumstances, but her long-term relationship with employment that had been permanently changed by recent events. "But I need to know that something like this won't happen again. I need to understand what protections exist if there are future conflicts with celebrity chefs or other staff members. Her question addressed the fundamental issue that Victor's apology hadn't touched, the systemic problems that had made her dismissal possible in the first place, the attitudes and procedures that would determine whether restoration of her position represented genuine change or simply temporary convenience until the next crisis provided excuse for similar treatment. Victor's response revealed both progress and limitations in his understanding of what needed to change to prevent future injustices. He offered procedural protections, promises to investigate conflicts thoroughly, requirements for corroborating evidence before personnel decisions, and direct communication channels that would prevent her concerns from being dismissed without consideration. But the conversation also made clear that Victor's perspective remained fundamentally unchanged regarding the hierarchical relationships that had enabled Rose's mistreatment initially. He offered protections without acknowledging the respect issues that had made false accusations credible, procedural reforms without addressing attitudinal changes that would prevent similar situations from developing. Rosa found herself weighing practical needs against personal principles, understanding that employment opportunities with comparable financial security were scarce, while also recognizing that accepting restoration without addressing underlying problems might simply postpone rather than prevent future difficulties. The decision required balancing immediate survival against long-term professional dignity. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, covering details of employment terms and working conditions that would define Rose's experience if she accepted Victor's offer of restoration. Some of his proposals addressed her concerns directly: clear authority over kitchen operations, protection from interference by temporary celebrity chefs, and regular performance evaluations that would provide documentation of her contributions and professional standing. Other aspects of the conversation revealed limitations in Victor's ability to understand Rose's perspective or fully address the damages that extended beyond simple employment termination. His focus remained primarily on practical arrangements rather than the emotional toll of false accusations, procedural protections rather than respectful treatment that acknowledged her expertise and value as a professional colleague rather than replaceable service provider. Rosa ultimately accepted Victor's offer, recognizing that practical necessities outweighed her reservations about incomplete changes in attitudes and relationships that might continue to create vulnerabilities in the future. The financial security was essential for her survival, and the restoration of her professional reputation would help repair damage that extended beyond this single employment situation. But she also negotiated additional conditions that reflected her newfound understanding of her own worth and the recognition Henry had helped her develop. She requested authority to train other staff members, opportunities to suggest menu modifications based on family preferences and dietary needs, and acknowledgement of her expertise and professional references that would describe her contributions accurately rather than simply confirming dates of employment. The negotiation process itself represented significant progress from Rosa's previous position, transforming her from passive recipient of employment terms to active participant in defining working conditions that would protect her interests and professional dignity. The experience of asserting her worth and demanding respectful treatment was empowering in ways that went beyond the specific agreements reached. Victor agreed to most of Rosa's requests, understanding that retaining her services required demonstrating genuine commitment to preventing future conflicts and acknowledging her professional status more explicitly than had been his previous practice. The comprehensive nature of their agreement suggested real changes in how their employment relationship would function going forward. The return to work was scheduled for the following Monday, allowing Rosa time to adjust to the dramatic change in her circumstances and to prepare emotionally for resuming duties in an environment where she had experienced such significant trauma. The intervening days provided opportunity for processing the complex emotions created by vindication, restoration, and the prospect of continued service under improved but still uncertain conditions. Henry's role in uncovering the truth and advocating for Rosa's vindication had deepened their friendship in ways that extended beyond their original teacher-student relationship. His willingness to challenge his uncle's decision and insist on investigating the evidence demonstrated loyalty and integrity that Rosa hadn't expected from someone whose privileged position might have made intervention both unnecessary and potentially uncomfortable. The experience had also revealed aspects of Henry's character that suggested genuine maturity and moral development that went beyond simple politeness or casual affection. His commitment to seeking justice for Rosa, despite potential family tensions, showed principles that hadn't been evident during their previous interactions, focused primarily on cooking techniques and kitchen camaraderie. Rosa's first day back in the penthouse kitchen felt simultaneously familiar and strange, returning to routines she knew completely while navigating relationships that had been permanently altered by recent events. The physical space was unchanged, but her emotional relationship to the environment reflected new understanding of both its possibilities and its limitations as a workplace where respect would need to be constantly maintained rather than automatically assumed. The other staff members' reactions to Rosa's return provided insights into how her dismissal and restoration had affected household dynamics beyond her direct experience. Some seemed genuinely pleased by her vindication and return, while others maintained cautious distance that suggested uncertainty about how power relationships might continue to evolve. The incident had demonstrated that security of employment wasn't guaranteed even for long-term competent staff, creating anxiety that extended beyond Rosa's personal experience. Margaret's interaction with Rosa was particularly revealing, showing embarrassment about her failure to question Jean-Claude's accusations or support an employee she had worked with successfully for years. Her attempts at normal conversation carried undertones of guilt that she seemed uncertain how to address directly, creating awkwardness that would require time and consistent professional interaction to resolve completely. The resumption of cooking for the family revealed how much Rosa's confidence and creativity had been affected by her experience of dismissal and unemployment, despite her vindication and restoration. She found herself second-guessing decisions that would have been automatic before, seeking more approval for routine choices, and generally approaching her work with caution that reflected underlying anxiety about job security that the recent crisis had created. But gradually, over the following weeks, Rosa began to rediscover the professional satisfaction and creative fulfillment that had made her work meaningful beyond its financial necessity. The improved working conditions that Victor had promised were largely maintained, providing greater autonomy and recognition than she had previously enjoyed even before the conflict with Jean-Claude. The relationship with Victor showed subtle but significant improvements, with more frequent acknowledgement of meal quality and occasional conversation that recognized Rosa's professional expertise rather than simply consuming her services without comment. While their interaction remained primarily formal, it carried greater mutual respect than had characterized their previous employment relationship. Most importantly, Rosa's sense of her own worth had been permanently strengthened through the experience of being sought out for restoration, having her innocence confirmed through evidence, and successfully negotiating improved working conditions that reflected recognition of her value. The trauma of false accusations and dismissal couldn't be erased, but it had been balanced by validation that provided foundation for greater professional confidence going forward. The correspondence with Henry continued and expanded, their relationship having been deepened through his advocacy during Rosa's crisis and their shared commitment to fairness and recognition of worth based on character and competence rather than social position or economic status. Their friendship had evolved beyond its original foundation in cooking instruction to encompass mutual respect and genuine affection that transcended class boundaries. Henry's summer visits to the penthouse became opportunities for continued collaboration in the kitchen, But now their work together carried additional significance as demonstration of relationships that could bridge social divides through shared interests and mutual respect. Rosa's teaching continued, but Henry's advocacy had transformed him from student to ally, whose support provided both practical help and emotional sustenance. The experience had also strengthened Rosa's understanding of her own expertise and its value, independent of others' recognition or acknowledgement. The period of unemployment and the process of restoration had forced her to articulate her skills, defend her professional reputation, and negotiate for appropriate treatment in ways that clarified her sense of personal worth and professional identity. As summer progressed into early fall, Rosa found herself approaching her work with renewed creativity and confidence that reflected both the improved working conditions Victor had provided and her own enhanced understanding of her capabilities and value. The kitchen became again a place of joy and creativity rather than simply obligation, allowing her to fully express the artistry that had drawn her to cooking originally. The calendar brought the anniversary of her original hiring by the Langley family, a date that now carried complex significance given recent events. Rosa had survived false accusations, wrongful dismissal, financial hardship, and professional doubt to emerge with stronger sense of her own worth and improved conditions for pursuing work she genuinely loved despite its challenges. The reflection on her journey revealed patterns of resilience and growth that Rosa hadn't fully recognized while experiencing them, demonstrated capacity for maintaining integrity under pressure and advocating for fair treatment when circumstances required it. The crisis had tested her character and revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Looking forward, Rosa could see possibilities for continued development, both personally and professionally, that hadn't existed before her experience of dismissal and restoration. The improved working conditions provided foundation for greater creativity and job satisfaction, while her enhanced self-awareness offered protection against future challenges to her dignity and professional standing. The relationship with the Langley family had been permanently altered, but in ways that generally represented improvement rather than simply recovery from temporary setback. Victor's acknowledgement of error and commitment to preventing similar problems showed genuine if incomplete progress in recognizing Rosa's value as professional colleague rather than simply service provider whose contributions could be dismissed without consequence. Margaret's increased awareness of household staff as individuals worthy of consideration and support represented similar progress, even if her change in attitude remained somewhat superficial and self-conscious. The incident had forced family members to confront their own assumptions about class, service, and the worth of people whose work they had previously taken entirely for granted. Most significantly, Rosa's own transformation through the experience of crisis and restoration had equipped her with greater clarity about her professional goals, stronger sense of personal worth, and enhanced ability to advocate for respectful treatment in whatever circumstances she might face in the future. The painful lessons learned through injustice had provided education that no amount of career success could have delivered. As autumn deepened and the anniversary of her restoration approached, Rosa began planning special meals that would celebrate not just the changing season, but her own survival and growth through challenges that had initially seemed likely to destroy everything she had worked to build. The kitchen filled with aromas that represented both tradition and innovation, continuity and change. The evening light streamed through the penthouse windows at angles that marked time's passage and the natural cycles that continued regardless of human drama and crisis, providing perspective that helped Rosa maintain balance between appropriate pride in her accomplishment and humility about the ongoing challenges that any life in service would continue to present. Her hands moved with practiced skill through familiar tasks that carried new meaning, each precise cut and measured spice representing not just professional competence, but personal triumph over circumstances that had tested her resilience and revealed reserves of strength she had never needed to access previously. The restoration had become transformation, recovery had become growth. The dinner she prepared that evening was served to family members who might not have fully understood its significance, but who consumed its excellences as evidence of Rosa's complete return to the professional standing she had earned through years of dedication and recently defended through months of challenge. Every bite carried flavors of vindication, each perfectly balanced sauce, reflecting confidence restored through struggle. As Rosa cleaned her kitchen after the evening's success, she reflected on journeys that had brought her through false accusations to vindication, from dismissal to restoration, from self-doubt to enhanced understanding of her own worth and capabilities. The familiar routines of closing down workspace carried new satisfaction, representing not just completion of daily duties, but ongoing commitment to excellence that no external circumstances could permanently destroy. The letters from Henry that had sustained her through the darkest period now arrived as communications between friends whose relationship had been tested and strengthened rather than casual correspondence between teacher and student. Their friendship represented proof that connection across social boundaries was possible when based on genuine mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity rather than service relationships defined by class and economic inequality. Rosa's small apartment, which had felt like prison during unemployment, had been transformed back into refuge where she could rest between challenging but meaningful days, space that provided privacy for processing experiences and planning for continued growth, both personal and professional. The cardboard box that had contained her dismissed belongings had been replaced by confidence that her position was now more secure because it was based on demonstrated worth rather than simply employer convenience. The subway rides between Queens and Manhattan no longer felt like journeys between different worlds where she existed as invisible service provider, but rather as commutes between home and workplace where she was recognized professional, whose contributions were valued and whose treatment reflected respect for her expertise and dedication. The same trains carried different passenger, transformed through experience into someone who understood her own worth independent of external validation. The financial security that employment provided was important, but Rosa now understood that it was only one component of job satisfaction that also required professional recognition, appropriate working conditions, and respectful treatment that acknowledged her humanity as well as her usefulness. The crisis had taught her to value these elements and to advocate for them when necessary. As winter approached with its familiar demands for comfort food and holiday preparations, Rosa found herself looking forward to challenges that would previously have felt like additional burdens. The enhanced working conditions and improved relationships provided foundation for creativity that could transform seasonal obligations into opportunities for demonstrating the artistry that made her work deeply satisfying rather than simply professionally competent. The story might have ended here, with Rosa's vindication and restoration representing satisfactory resolution to injustices that had temporarily derailed her career and threatened her financial security. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions, and Rosa's journey was about to enter a new phase that would build on lessons learned through crisis to create possibilities she had never imagined when her ambitions were limited to excellent service within other people's household routines. The transformation was beginning to extend beyond Rosa's personal recovery toward broader changes that would affect not just her individual circumstances, but the treatment and recognition of skilled domestic workers whose contributions had been invisible for too long. Her experience of injustice and restoration had prepared her for roles she hadn't anticipated, challenges that would require all the strength and wisdom she had gained through surviving circumstances that could have easily destroyed someone with less resilience and determination. But that next chapter of Rosa's story begins with autumn evening in the penthouse kitchen, where she worked with renewed confidence and creativity, surrounded by aromas of success that marked not just the completion of another excellent meal, but the triumph of character over circumstance, of worth over wealth, of human dignity over social hierarchy that had too long defined the boundaries of what seemed possible for someone whose value was measured in service rather than status, in contribution rather than position, in heart rather than inheritance. The kitchen windows reflected Rosa's image back to her as she completed the evening's work, showing someone who had learned to see herself through eyes that recognized competence, resilience, and worth that couldn't be destroyed by false accusations or restored by employer generosity alone. The reflection showed professional who understood her value and possessed strength to defend it, teacher who had learned by being tested, human being who had grown through suffering into wisdom. Outside those windows, New York City continued its restless energy, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success and security, dreams and survival. Among them moved countless workers whose contributions made comfortable life possible for others, invisible people whose skills and dedication sustained households and businesses while receiving little recognition or respect for service that was essential to the functioning of society that preferred not to acknowledge its dependence on their labor. Rosa had become representative of those workers, someone who had experienced both the injustices and the possibilities that defined their shared condition. Her journey from invisible service through false accusation to vindicated expertise provided evidence that change was possible, that recognition could be achieved, that dignity could be defended even within systems designed to maintain inequality and exploitation. The lessons learned through Rosa's experience extended far beyond her personal circumstances to address questions that affected anyone whose security depended on others' recognition of their worth, whose daily work contributed more value than their daily compensation suggested, whose humanity was diminished by service relationships that treated them as functions rather than people deserving respect and consideration. As Rosa hung up her apron and prepared to leave the kitchen where she had experienced both her greatest professional satisfaction and her most devastating personal crisis, she carried with her understanding that her individual story was part of a larger narrative about work and worth, justice and recognition, the possibility of dignity within service, and the power of persistence in the face of systematic dismissal of people whose contributions were essential, but whose status was considered dispensable. The train that carried her home through the darkness of New York evening was filled with people whose stories paralleled her own in countless variations, workers whose skills sustained the city's comfortable life while their own security remained precarious, professionals whose expertise was essential but whose recognition was optional, human beings whose worth was measured in payment rather than respected in treatment. Rosa's vindication provided hope for all of them, evidence that justice was possible even when it required struggle, that recognition could be achieved even when it needed to be demanded rather than granted freely, that individual worth could be defended even within systems designed to suppress it in favor of convenience for those with power to hire and fire based on accusations they preferred not to investigate carefully. Her small apartment welcomed her with warmth that reflected not just physical comfort, but emotional satisfaction of someone who had learned to value her own accomplishments and contributions independent of others' acknowledgement or appreciation. The space provided refuge where she could process daily experiences and plan for continued growth that built on foundations strengthened through surviving crisis that had initially threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build. The correspondence with Henry awaited on her table, another letter filled with updates on his college experience and appreciation for ongoing friendship that had enriched both their lives through connection that transcended social boundaries and class differences. Their relationship provided evidence that mutual respect and genuine affection could flourish when people approached each other as individuals worthy of consideration, rather than representatives of economic categories that supposedly determined their relative worth. Rosa's reflection on her journey revealed patterns of resilience that extended beyond individual character to represent possibilities available to anyone willing to defend their dignity and advocate for fair treatment, even when circumstances seem to make such advocacy risky or futile. Her experience provided roadmap for maintaining self-respect while working in service positions that could either affirm or diminish human worth depending on how they were approached by both workers and employers. The future stretched ahead with possibilities Rosa hadn't imagined when her goals were limited to excellent performance within constraints defined by others' expectations and comfort levels. The crisis had revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and opportunities she hadn't recognized for expanding her influence beyond individual service to broader advocacy for recognition and respect for skilled workers whose contributions made comfortable life possible for people who preferred not to acknowledge their dependence on such service. As Rosa prepared for sleep that would restore her energy for tomorrow's challenges and opportunities, she understood that her story had become larger than personal survival and professional restoration. Her experience provided evidence that change was possible, that justice could be achieved, that recognition could be earned, even by people whose status was supposed to limit their expectations and possibilities. The city continued its restless energy outside her windows, filled with people pursuing their own versions of success and security. But Rosa's understanding of those possibilities had expanded through experience that revealed connections between individual worth and broader questions of justice, recognition, and the treatment of people whose work was essential, but whose status was considered dispensable by systems designed to maintain inequality and exploitation. Her journey from invisible service through false accusation to vindicated expertise had prepared her for roles she was only beginning to imagine. Challenges that would require all the strength and wisdom gained through surviving circumstances that could have destroyed someone with less resilience and determination. The foundation had been laid for next chapter of Rosa's story, built on lessons learned through injustice overcome and dignity defended against forces that preferred convenient fiction to inconvenient truth. But tonight, Rosa rested in satisfaction of a work performed excellently despite challenge, relationships maintained despite adversity, and self-worth preserved despite systematic attempts to diminish it. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities built on foundation of strength tested and proven, wisdom earned through suffering transformed into growth, and understanding that individual worth transcended external validation because it was based on character revealed through challenge rather than status granted through privilege or position. The story continued, but this evening marked milestone in journey that had transformed service into strength, crisis into character, and individual experience into broader understanding of possibilities available to anyone willing to defend their dignity and advocate for recognition of worth that couldn't be destroyed by false accusations or restored by employer generosity alone, but had to be claimed and maintained through personal integrity that no external circumstances could permanently diminish. Years had passed since that transformative period of crisis and restoration, time that had brought changes Rosa could never have anticipated when her world seemed bounded by the gleaming surfaces of the Langley penthouse kitchen. The autumn of her 4th year back in their employ arrived with news that would shift everything once again, but this time toward possibilities rather than threats, toward expansion rather than elimination. Henry had graduated from college with business degree and entrepreneurial ambitions that combined his appreciation for authentic food with his understanding of market forces that could make quality accessible to broader audiences than traditional fine dining typically reached. His experience in Rosa's kitchen, learning the difference between technique and artistry, had convinced him that exceptional food didn't require molecular gastronomy pretensions or celebrity chef theatrics to create satisfaction that nourished both body and spirit. "I want to open a restaurant," Henry announced during one of their collaboration sessions in the penthouse kitchen, his voice carrying excitement tempered by realistic understanding of challenges involved in such ventures. "Not another trendy place that treats food as performance art, but somewhere that serves the kind of meals you've been teaching me to make. Food that carries stories and makes people feel cared for." The proposal was ambitious in its scope and revolutionary in its implications for Rosa's career trajectory, offering possibilities she had never considered when her professional goals were limited to excellent service within other people's households. Henry wasn't simply suggesting employment, he was proposing partnership that would elevate her from invisible service provider to recognized expert whose knowledge would shape every aspect of restaurant operations. "I want you to be head chef," Henry continued, his words hitting Rosa with force of opportunities she had never dared imagine. Not just cooking, but designing menus, training staff, creating the entire dining experience. You'd have complete creative control over food preparation, and your name would be featured prominently in all of our marketing materials. The offer represented validation of everything Rosa had worked to achieve through years of developing expertise that had been largely invisible to those who consumed its results. Henry's recognition of her abilities and his willingness to stake his business reputation on her skills provided acknowledgement she had never expected to receive from anyone, much less someone whose social position could have made such partnership professionally risky for him. But the proposal also created anxiety about leaving security. She had fought so hard to restore her venture that would depend entirely on public acceptance of her cooking and management abilities in competitive marketplace, where failure could eliminate not just employment, but professional reputation entirely. The transition from service to ownership would require confidence. Rosa wasn't certain she possessed, despite years of evidence supporting her competence. "I understand it's a big decision," Henry said, recognizing her hesitation and the legitimate concerns it reflected. "But I've been watching you work for years, and I've learned enough about business to know that restaurants succeed when they serve food. People genuinely want to eat, prepared by someone who understands that cooking is about more than just combining ingredients correctly." Their conversation continued over several weeks, Henry providing detailed business plans that showed serious research into restaurant operations, financing requirements, and market analysis that supported his confidence in Rosa's abilities to succeed in expanded role. His preparation demonstrated commitment that went far beyond casual enthusiasm, suggesting genuine partnership rather than impulsive gesture motivated by personal affection or misguided charity. The restaurant concept he envisioned would feature comfort food, elevated through technique and attention to quality ingredients, meals that satisfied sophisticated palates while remaining accessible to diverse clientele who valued authenticity over pretension. The menu would change seasonally to highlight fresh ingredients and would include dishes inspired by Rosa's cultural background, alongside American classics prepared with care and creativity that distinguished them from institutional or commercial variations. Rosa consulted with Victor about the opportunity, seeking his perspective on venture's viability and Henry's business acumen, but also testing his reaction to possibility that she might leave position she had worked so hard to restore. His response revealed how much their relationship had changed since her wrongful dismissal and subsequent vindication, showing respect for her professional judgment and support for her career advancement that would have been unimaginable during their previous employer-employee dynamic. "Henry has sound business instincts," Victor acknowledged, his evaluation carrying weight of someone whose investment decisions had built substantial wealth through careful analysis of entrepreneurial potential. His concept addresses real market opportunities, and his financial projections are realistic rather than overly optimistic. More importantly, he's chosen the right partner. Your skills and knowledge could make this venture very successful. The endorsement from Victor provided external validation of Rosa's abilities that helped counterbalance her internal doubts about making such significant career transition. His business perspective confirmed that Henry's offer represented genuine opportunity rather than charitable gesture, partnership based on competence rather than sentiment. Margaret's reaction was more emotional, reflecting personal connection that had developed slowly over years of Rosa's service and had been deepened by her experience of crisis and restoration. Her support emphasized human elements of decision that transcended business calculations, acknowledging bonds that had formed despite class differences and service relationships that supposedly prevented genuine friendship between employers and employees. "You deserve this opportunity," Margaret said with conviction that surprised Rosa with its intensity. "You've given so much to our family over the years, and we've never properly acknowledged how much your care has meant to all of us. Henry is offering you the recognition you should have received long ago." The decision-making process extended through the winter months as Rosa carefully evaluated all aspects of the opportunity. Consulting with small business advisors, visiting comparable restaurants to observe operations, and gradually building confidence that she possessed skills necessary for success in management role that would require abilities she had developed but never fully tested. Henry's patience during her deliberation period demonstrated maturity and business wisdom that reinforced Rosa's growing confidence in his partnership potential. He provided information and support without pressure, answered questions thoroughly, and modified plans based on her suggestions in ways that confirmed genuine collaborative approach rather than predetermined arrangement where her role would be subordinate to his vision. The financial arrangements Henry proposed were generous and equitable, offering Rosa ownership stake in restaurant operations rather than simple employment contract, creating shared investment in success that aligned their interests and provided Rosa with wealth-building opportunities she could never achieve through service positions, regardless of their quality or compensation level. Spring brought Rosa's final decision to accept Henry's partnership offer, ending her employment with the Langley family on terms that preserved relationships she valued while opening a new chapter in career that would allow her to share expertise with broader audiences and receive recognition that had been limited to private appreciation within household settings. The departure from penthouse service was emotional for everyone involved, marking end of relationship that had evolved from simple employment to genuine caring that transcended class boundaries and service arrangements. The farewell dinner Rosa prepared became celebration of partnership that had enriched all their lives, despite challenges that had initially threatened to destroy connections they had come to value deeply. The restaurant planning process occupied the following months, with details that would determine both ventures' success and Rosa's professional satisfaction in her new role as head chef and co-owner of establishment that would bear her name and showcase her abilities in ways she had never anticipated when her career goals were limited to excellent service within other people's kitchens. The location Henry secured was in Brooklyn, a neighborhood experiencing revitalization that created opportunities for businesses offering quality products at reasonable prices to audiences who appreciated authenticity over pretension. The space required renovation to create dining room atmosphere that would complement Rosa's food while maintaining comfortable informality that welcomed diverse clientele rather than intimidating them with excessive formality. Rosa's input shaped every aspect of restaurant design, from kitchen layout optimized for efficient preparation of her menu items to dining room decor that created warmth without sacrificing style, atmosphere that would make guests feel welcomed rather than merely served. Her vision emphasized comfort and satisfaction over impression and status, reflecting values that had guided her cooking throughout her career. The menu development process allowed Rosa to showcase range and creativity that had been constrained by household service, creating dishes that reflected her cultural background and professional training while appealing to diverse tastes and dietary requirements of contemporary dining audiences. Each item was tested extensively to ensure quality consistency that would maintain reputation regardless of which staff members prepared specific orders. Staff training became opportunity for Rosa to share knowledge and techniques she had spent years developing, creating a team that understood food preparation as craft requiring skill and attention rather than simply following recipes mechanically. Her teaching abilities, first discovered through work with Henry, proved essential to building consistent service quality that would sustain restaurants' reputation and success. The restaurant opening was scheduled for late fall, allowing summer and early autumn for preparation that would ensure smooth operations from first day of service. The anticipation created nervous excitement as opening date approached, representing culmination of career transformation Rosa could never have imagined when her professional goals were limited to excellent performance within service positions defined by others' expectations and comfort levels. Media attention leading up to opening focused on human interest aspects of Rosa's journey from household service to restaurant ownership, story that resonated with audiences interested in mobility narratives and recognition of skilled workers whose contributions had previously been invisible. The coverage provided publicity that money couldn't have purchased, creating community interest that filled reservation books even before restaurant opened. The opening night exceeded everyone's expectations, drawing crowds that appreciated both food quality and atmosphere Rosa and Henry had worked months to perfect. Reviews praised authenticity and craftsmanship that distinguished their establishment from trendy restaurants that prioritized innovation over satisfaction, creating reputation that would sustain long-term success rather than depending on novelty that might fade quickly. Rosa's transformation from invisible service provider to recognized professional whose expertise shaped successful business venture provided inspiration that extended beyond her individual achievement. Her story demonstrated possibilities available to skilled workers willing to defend their dignity and advocate for recognition of abilities that were essential but undervalued in service relationships defined by class and economic inequality. The restaurant became a gathering place for community members who appreciated food prepared with care and attention, environment where Rosa's values of nourishment and hospitality created dining experiences that satisfied emotional as well as physical hunger. Regular customers developed personal connections with Rosa that reflected genuine appreciation for her skills and contribution to neighborhood life. Henry's business management combined with Rosa's culinary expertise proved effective partnership that generated profits sufficient to expand operations and increase staff wages above industry standards, demonstrating that successful businesses could prioritize employee welfare alongside investor returns. Their model provided evidence that ethical business practices could be financially sustainable in competitive marketplace. The success attracted attention from food critics and business analysts who recognized significance of Rosa's achievement in context of broader discussions about economic mobility, recognition of skilled labor, and possibilities for partnerships that crossed traditional class boundaries. Her restaurant became case study in inclusive business practices that created opportunities for advancement based on competence rather than inherited advantage. Awards and recognition followed, including designation as one of city's best neighborhood restaurants, and recognition of Rosa as emerging chef whose story inspired others to pursue opportunities they had previously considered impossible given their backgrounds and service positions. The acknowledgement validated choices she had made to defend dignity and advocate for fair treatment, despite risks involved in challenging established power relationships. The correspondence with Langley family continued, maintaining friendships that had developed through shared experiences of crisis and growth. Their relationship had evolved from employer-employee dynamics to genuine personal connections that provided mutual satisfaction, independent of service arrangements that had originally brought them together. Victor became regular customer whose business meetings at Rosa's restaurant demonstrated his continued respect for her abilities and pride in her achievements. His presence provided implicit endorsement that attracted other successful individuals who valued food quality over trendy presentations, creating clientele that sustained restaurants' reputation and profitability. Margaret organized social events at restaurant that showcased Rosa's catering abilities while maintaining personal connection that had grown stronger since Rosa's departure from household service. Their friendship represented successful navigation of class boundaries that supposedly prevented genuine relationships between people whose social positions were supposed to determine their relative worth and interaction possibilities. The restaurant's success enabled Rosa to purchase a small house in Brooklyn near her business, achieving home ownership that provided security and investment opportunities she could never have accessed through service employment, regardless of its quality or compensation level. The property represented tangible evidence of career transformation that had created wealth-building possibilities alongside professional satisfaction. Community involvement became a natural extension of Rosa's values, providing catering services for local charity events, offering cooking classes that taught techniques to neighborhood residents, and creating internship opportunities for young people interested in culinary careers who lacked resources for formal training programs. Her success generated opportunities to contribute to others' advancement in ways that reflected values learned through her own struggles. The 5th anniversary of restaurant opening was celebrated with special menu featuring dishes that told story of Rosa's journey from invisible service through crisis and restoration to recognition and success. The event attracted media coverage that emphasized themes of perseverance, dignity, and possibilities available to anyone willing to work hard and advocate for fair treatment of their contributions. Rosa's speech that evening reflected on transformation that had begun with false accusations and wrongful dismissal, but had ultimately led to opportunities she could never have imagined when her professional goals were constrained by others' expectations and definitions of appropriate ambitions for someone with her background and service position. Success isn't just about achieving your dreams, she told audience of friends, customers, and community members who had supported restaurant's growth. It's about maintaining your dignity while pursuing those dreams, treating others with respect regardless of their position, and remembering that everyone's work has value even when that value isn't immediately recognized or appropriately compensated. The message resonated with audience members whose own experiences reflected similar challenges in achieving recognition for skills and contributions that were essential but undervalued in employment relationships defined by class and economic inequality. Rosa's story provided evidence that change was possible for anyone willing to persist through difficulty and advocate for fair treatment. The evening concluded with announcement of Rosa's plans to write cookbook that would share recipes and techniques alongside stories about dignity, work, and recognition that extended beyond individual success to address broader questions about how society values different types of contributions and those who make them. The book would create opportunities to reach audiences beyond restaurant customers, expanding influence of values Rosa had maintained through years of challenge and growth. As the celebration ended, and Rosa reflected on a journey that had brought her from invisible service through crisis to recognition and success, she understood that her story represented possibilities available to anyone willing to defend their dignity and pursue opportunities even when circumstances seemed to limit expectations and chances for advancement beyond predetermined boundaries. The restaurant continued operating successfully, providing platform for Rosa's ongoing contributions to community life and professional achievement that reflected values learned through surviving injustice and maintaining integrity despite pressures to accept treatment that diminished her worth and potential. Her success created model for others facing similar challenges in service positions where recognition and advancement required advocacy and persistence. The future stretched ahead with possibilities Rosa continued to discover as opportunities expanded through success that had been built on foundation of character, tested through adversity and wisdom, gained through experience of defending dignity against forces that preferred convenient submission to inconvenient insistence on fair treatment and appropriate recognition of valuable contributions. Her small house provided refuge where she could rest between challenging but meaningful days, space that represented security achieved through competence and persistence rather than inherited advantage or others' generosity. The property symbolized transformation that had created wealth alongside professional satisfaction, demonstrating that success could be achieved without compromising values or accepting treatment that diminished human worth. The neighborhood around Rosa's restaurant became second home, where she was known and respected for contributions that extended beyond business success to community involvement that reflected commitment to others' advancement and recognition. Her presence enriched local life in ways that validated choice to build career around service that nourished others while maintaining dignity and self-respect. And you, have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever felt invisible while feeding everyone around you? Tell me in the comments about a time when your work wasn't recognized the way it deserved to be. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who works with dedication but rarely receives the appreciation she deserves. For more emotional stories like this, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story.